Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second seminar of our new monthly series, where we aim to highlight rigorous research in the scientific study of international migration. We are so glad that you were able to join us today. My name is Dominic Hainmueller. I'm faculty co-director of IPL, and I'll be moderating this webinar today. Before we begin, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items. This session, as you know, is being recorded. A recording of the presentation will be available on the Immigration Policy Lab and also on our YouTube channel. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation by using the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. During the last 15 minutes, I will select a few questions for our presenter to answer. Unfortunately, due to our limited time together, we will not be able to answer all of your questions. At the end of the webinar, we will send a link to a Google form in the Zoom chat where you can provide feedback and also suggest speakers for future seminars. This link can also be found on the website of the Immigration Policy Lab. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jens Hainmueller. Jens, who agreed to jump in on short notice because another speaker had to cancel, but this other speaker will present in a future iteration of the seminar in the not-too-distant future. Jens is professor of political science at Stanford University, co-founder and faculty co-director of the Immigration Policy Lab. His research spans statistical methods with a focus on causal inference, immigration, and political economy, and he is the most cited political scientist of his age cohort. Jens will share insights from our new research on an innovative employment program for refugees in Germany. Both the program and the research are currently hotly debated in German news and policy circles, so we are excited to hear more about this. Thank you, Jens, over to you.
Thanks very much, Dominic, and welcome everyone, wherever you are in the world. This morning, it's morning here in California. I'm very excited to present to you this research project that we're currently working on that looks at the labor market integration of refugees in Germany. We just posted a working paper. We'll share out the link to that as well if you want to look at more of the details. And this is joint work with Moritz Marbach at UCL, Dominic Hangartner, who you've just seen at ETH, Nicholas Harder at DECIM, and Ezan Valides at the BA. And so very much looking forward to your comments and your feedback. The motivation for this paper is really the fact that Europe, as many of you are very well aware, has seen repeated refugee crises over the last decades. And so what characterizes these displacement crises is that in a very short amount of time, a very large number of people are arriving in Europe, creating potentially tremendous pressures for host countries. We've seen this, for example, with the Yugoslavian crisis, the Kosovo crisis, the Syrian-Afghan crisis, and then most recently, obviously, with the Ukrainian displacement crisis, where over 4 million Ukrainian refugees were entering in European countries in a very short period of time. So that's about 1% of the local population. And while for many, this arrival of so many people has been characterized as a potential opportunity to get skilled workers into labor markets that are suffering from aging populations, others have worried that how can host countries really integrate so many people so quickly. And so this paper is about one of the approaches that the German government has taken to deal with the arrival of over 1 million Ukrainian refugees in the context of the German labor market. So in general, right, what happens in the sudden displacement crisis is that you get very strong pressures on the institutional and logistical framework for host countries, right? Over these countries typically have some policies set up to regulate a normal, more predictable inflow of refugees, but during these crises, the capacity is quickly exceeded, and you have large cohorts that need some integration support. And so for policy, it really begs this question of what are scalable programs that you can really scale up in a short period of time that might be effective in terms of facilitating the integration of refugees into the labor market. And this is important because we know from a lot of literature, right, that the labor market integration of refugees is not always seamless, and that refugees face very well-documented barriers to labor market entry, especially in European labor market. And these range from sort of limited host country proficiency to the non-recognition of credentials the unfamiliarity with the local job search and institutions, but also the psychological distress, social isolation, and trauma that can come from the displacement experience. And so what we see in many European countries is that even many years after arrival, refugees have lower employment and earnings rate than natives and other migrant groups. And we also know from research that policy interventions that happen early after arrival, in this what we often refer to as the sort of the early integration window, can be particularly important for long-term outcomes. So I think one big question for research is what can governments really do to accelerate refugee labor market integration, and how can they do it at scale in these situations where you need to scale programs up, and how can you do it at reasonable cost? So what we are going to be studying in this paper is one particularly innovative policy that the German government launched in October 2023, which is called the Job Turbo. And this was a program that was designed to accelerate the employment among refugees, primarily Ukrainian refugees, but the program also targeted refugees from the 8 major origin groups in Germany, which are Afghans, Eritreans, Iranians, Iraqis, Nigerians, Pakistanis, Somalis, and Syrians. And so the goal of the program was to speed up the labor market integration of these refugee groups via intensive job search counseling that was designed to be sort of targeted towards refugees that were just completing their mandatory integration courses, which give them basic language training in Germany. And so the idea of the program was that there were 3 phases. There was sort of like a basic language training phase. Then there was a second phase, which was focused on rapid job placement. And then a third phase, which was focused on on-the-job training and consolidation of the labor market entry. And the focus of the program was really on that job placement phase, where the idea was that refugees that were completing these courses, got their basic language training, would get the first counseling contact towards the end of the course, and then really experience sort of mandatory contacts every 6 weeks for a period of 6 months to try to help them get a footing in the labor market and place them into jobs quickly. And so that was the idea of the program. And I think this program is very interesting from a research perspective for at least 3 reasons. The first one is that this was not a small sort of pilot program. Like, this was really a program that the German government decided to roll out on a nationwide scale amidst this very large displacement crisis. So it constitutes sort of a major policy investment of one of the major host countries. And I think from that perspective, it provides interesting lessons of what can happen when these policies are rolled out at scale, and potentially provide important lessons for other countries facing similar issues. The second reason why this program, I think, is of interest to research is that really, for the very first time, I think in Germany in particular, it sort of characterizes a bit of a departure, at least a modest departure, from this qualification first approach that we've seen in many European countries, where the idea typically is that refugees first have to get their credentials recognized, they have to get all of the training, and then are phased into the labor market very slowly, in contrast to sort of a work first approach that we see in some other countries, like in the US, for example, right, where the idea is like you get into the labor market extremely quickly. In this case, the Germans were basically moving from a qualification first approach towards more of a middle path between qualification and work first approaches. And so I think this paradigm shift is really interesting to see what returns can be gained from that, and again, providing important lessons for other countries that are more on the qualification first approach as well. And then the third reason, I think, is that there's an evidence gap. So several studies have looked at the effect of intensified job search counseling, but most of them focus on natives or non-refugee migrants. There aren't actually a lot of studies that look at refugees or the effects of job counseling for refugees in particular. Okay, and so the link to the website, to the working paper, is down there if you're interested in the details, but this is basically the results that I'm going to be presenting today. Okay, so what do we know from previous evidence? Lots of studies has obviously looked into the labor market integration of refugees. And I think one sort of summary is that unfortunately, a lot of well-intended programs often don't really seem to generate large returns, or some of them have even backfired. So we've seen, for example, a couple of papers looking at employment bans, that those have really backfired. Integration contracts really only limited effects. Some studies look at the benefit cuts, which also have shown sort of limited impacts. And then when it comes to wage subsidies, I think there's been some promising evidence, but these programs are very expensive, and also some mixed evidence for migrants. And then when it comes to job search assistance, I think this has been reasonably successful for natives, but there's like less work on whether this would translate to refugees, which have particularly challenges in terms of labor market integration, obviously. So the closest study that we could find to what we are doing here is this small Swedish pilot in this Jona Nepke paper from 2012, where in Sweden they ran a job search counseling pilot for refugees in Sweden, and they found a 13% reduction in unemployment. Now this was a much smaller pilot program. Here we're looking at a nationwide program, and so often what we find, right, is that in smaller pilots, maybe programs work well, but then when they're rolled out at scale, often the effects might be diluted. So we were going into this with an uncertain sort of expectation about whether this is gonna work or not. Okay, so the research questions are, we're going to first be looking at whether the job tour program was successful in terms of increasing the refugee caseworker contact rates, which was one of the central ideas of the program. And then we're going to see whether this then ultimately resulted in better employment outcomes for Ukrainian refugees and other refugees. And then we're going to try to see how these effects are heterogeneous or homogeneous across demographic groups, regions, skill levels, unemployment durations. We're going to see whether the placements were durable, right? Or whether this just led to sort of short-term placements that then end very quickly. We're going to look at potentially negative spillovers for non-refugee job seekers. And we're also going to try to get a little bit at the mechanisms of how this program might have affected outcomes. And then we also do at least the rudimentary sort of cost-benefit calculations to get some sense of what were the fiscal costs and benefits for taxpayers in terms of the program. Okay, so before we go there quickly, when we were starting to work on this, obviously there was already press coverage of the program. And I think the press reception of the program was fairly poor overall. So here are just a couple of German headlines. Maybe it was the name of the program, Jobtober or something, that immediately invited a lot of criticism. One observer called it complete nonsense. And so we were going into this not knowing, okay, is this program successful? Is it not successful? And so we thought, let's look at some systematic numbers to get a bit more systematic evidence on this. Okay, so basically the program operates through the job centers in Germany. On the right here, you see a map of all of the different job centers that are operating. There's a nationwide network of job centers that are operating, and these are public agencies that are basically designed to support job seekers, and in particular sort of registered unemployed job seekers that are receiving the citizens benefit, so like basic support called the Bürgergeld. And the idea is that in these job centers there are sort of frontline caseworkers that sort of work with job seekers in order to help them find work. So they develop personalized employment plans, they monitor progress, and they also enforce participation. These employment plans can come in the form of like career counseling, enrollment and training programs, but also like intensifying the job search in terms of identifying vacancies, helping them with applications, and so on. The contacts usually occur via phone, video, or in person. And in the case of refugees, they also often involve translators. You can see here in the map that there's two types of job centers. There are the ones that are operated by the Federal Employment Agency, which are the green ones. There's 300 of them, and we're mostly going to be focusing on those. There's also another set of job centers that are operated in the so-called Optionskommunen, which are more independently operated by the local jurisdictions. And we have some limited results for those, but for most of what you see, we'll focus on the 300 that are operated by the Federal Employment Agency. Okay. And so I think this is very much a prerequisite for this program, is that you have like a robust public employment search sort of agency set up with this network that they activated for this particular program. Okay, so what is going to be the empirical strategy here? In this study, what we do is we work with aggregate level data at the job center level. So we have these 300 job centers, and we're going to have a monthly panel for each of them where we observe labor market outcomes for 4 groups in particular. We're going to look at 2 treatment groups, which are the Ukrainian refugees and what we call the other refugees, which are the refugees from these 8 major origin countries. And we're going to compare those trajectories for these 2 treatment groups with the trajectories for 2 control groups, which are going to be other immigrants in Germany. On the one hand, that's going to be sort of the primary control group. And then we're also going to, as a secondary control group, use German nationals. Now, these outcomes that we're going to be looking at are focused on the sample of people who are registered as unemployed and therefore are sort of like clients of these local job centers and participating in these contexts. The time frame of our data is going to run from October 2022 to August 2025. So this gives us about a 23-month follow-up period from the launch of the program, which was launched in October 2023. Okay. How are we going to try to identify the effect of the program? Well, the way how we're going to do it is we're going to focus on the average treatment effect on the treated, which is going to compare, right, what happened in terms of labor market outcomes to the treatment groups with the counterfactual, the unobserved counterfactual of what would have happened in a world in which the job table would not have been implemented. And the way how we're going to basically estimate this unobserved counterfactual here is we're going to use for the baseline specification an interactive fixed effects model, where we're going to basically predict the outcomes under the non-intervention as a function of 2-way fixed effects, so job center nationality fixed effects that are basically going to pick up anything that's time invariant and specific to the group and the job center in the local labor market. We're going to have period fixed effects on the month level that are going to pick up these sort of monthly shocks that might happen, seasonality and things like this. And then we're also going to have this interactive fixed effects component here, which is sort of this low rank composition that's going to capture time varying forces that might have heterogeneous impact. So if there's like a general shock that has a different effect on different groups in different labor markets, then this is something that might be absorbed here. Okay, and so this is the identification strategy that we're going to be using here. And we're going to look at sort of, in terms of whether there were deviations from parallel trends prior to the treatment, and then we're going to see whether there are deviations after, just like in any diffs and diffs paper. Okay, so what are the 2 central outcomes? We're going to be looking at many different outcomes, but these are the 2 central ones. We're going to look at the contact rate. This is basically defined as the number of registered unemployed clients that were contacted in a given month from a given group, scaled by the lagged stock of the number of unemployed clients from that group in that specific job center in the previous month. Okay, so this is basically measures the frequency of the caseworker interactions, what share of the registered unemployed actually ended up getting a contact. And we can look at that because the contact data is available to us, which is one of the strengths of this study, because often the contact data is sort of not really available in these kinds of studies. Then we're going to be looking at the exit to job rate. That's sort of the central outcome of interest, right, from a policy perspective, and pretty standard in these kinds of studies. So this is the exit to job rate, which basically measures the share of registered unemployed clients that in a given month transition from unemployment into working in a specific job. And we're going to be looking at especially jobs in what's called the first labor market in Germany, excluding like mini jobs and these kinds of things. So these are basically mostly full-time employment that happen in the primary labor market. And we're going to look at the share of individuals transition from unemployment into these jobs, again, scaled by the stock of unemployed in the previous month. Okay. So, and then we're going to break down this exit rate by different demographic groups, duration, the job skill level, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. All right. So what do we find in this study? I'm going to start with some descriptive results just to give you some sense. And in many ways, this tells like the main story of the paper. So what you see here is you see the contact rate, right? Normalized for the 4 groups such that every group starts at 100 in the month prior to when the program was launched. So this was September 2023. You see the vertical line here, the dashed line, that's the launch of the program. And what we have are the four groups. So we have the Ukrainian refugees in yellow, we have the other refugees in light green, and then we have the other immigrants, the first control group in a darker green, and then in blue we have the German nationals, which is the secondary control group. And what you can see here is that prior to when the Job Turbo was launched, these groups basically follow parallel trends. You see there's a bit of seasonality, obviously, in these contact rates, in particular during the holidays. The contact rates drop. That's what are some of these like big ups and downs. But in general, you see that they're following parallel trends up to when the program is launched. And then once the program is launched, what we see is that the contact rates for Ukrainian refugees are increasing. You see this kink there in the line that are increasing to like a higher level of what we see in terms of the pre-treatment trajectory and the trajectory post-treatment for the control groups, indicating that the contact rate basically increased as a result of the program. We also see that there's an increase for the other treatment group, which are the other refugees, and that increase is not quite as large as what we see for the Ukrainian refugees. So based on these descriptive results, we would indicate that there's a positive average treatment effect on the treated for Ukrainian refugees and other refugees. Now, did this translate into increased placement success into jobs? What we see here are the corresponding results for the exit to job rate, sort of the central outcome variable. And what you can see here is a very similar picture where leading into the program, we have basically parallel trends prior to when the intervention started. But then once the intervention starts, we see a pretty dramatic increase in the exit to job rate for the Ukrainian refugees. So you can see that it kind of like almost doubles. And we also see, with a bit of a delay, also an increase for the other refugees, while for the two control groups, we basically see is kind of a continuation on the previous trend. Now we see for the Ukrainians here that the effect kind of kicks in particular in January 2024, so a little bit after the program was launched. This kind of makes sense when you look at how this program was rolled out, because in October 2023, that's when the program was first publicly announced with a big press conference with the minister and the labor market agency. But then it took until January 2024 to basically get the directive out to local job centers about, how are they supposed to increase the counseling for the two target groups. So that internal directive went out in January, and that's when you start seeing the biggest effects basically occurring. Also, there would be a delay right from contacts to placements because it takes some time to find the placement. Okay, so here are the formal estimates then from the interactive fixed effects models. And what we see here, just to give you some sense of the magnitudes of these effects, is that we have the Ukrainian refugees here on the top, the contact rate on the left, the exit to job rate on the right, and then in the bottom row, we have the other refugee group, the second treatment group. Let's look at Ukrainian refugees first in terms of the contact rate. So what we see is that at baseline, the contact rate was about 27% in the month prior to the intervention. And then we have like this increase when you average over the post-treatment period, the 23-month post-treatment period, we estimate on average an increase of about 15 percentage points that would not have happened in the absence of the treatment. If you do that in terms, comparing to the baseline, right, we see that that's about a 54% increase. And in terms of total contacts, it amounts to about 500,000 additional contacts for Ukrainian refugees. Now, when you think about the exit to job rate here on the right, what did that do in terms of increased placements? We see that the baseline rate was about 1.6%. The average treatment effect on the treated over the 23 follow-up period is about 1.8 percentage point. So that indicates that the refugees, the exit to job rate basically about doubled. Okay, so almost 113% increase over the baseline. And in terms of total numbers, this amounts to about 58,000 extra placements that would not have happened in the absence of the treatment. So quite significant increases as a result of the policy. For other refugees, the effects are smaller, as we can see. So there's about a 2.4% increase in terms of the contacts only. The baseline rate is fairly similar. And then when we look at the average treatment effect on the treated in terms of the exit to job rate, we see an increase of about 1 percentage point. So you see about 8% increase in terms of contacts, about 28% increase in terms of the exit to job rate. So about 100,000 additional contacts and about 45,000 additional placements. So the response to the contacts potentially stronger for other refugees, but the overall increase in the number of contacts much smaller for other refugees than for Ukrainians, which maybe might make sense from the perspective that the Ukrainians were sort of like the reason why this program was launched, and sort of maybe the primary target group from the perspective of the caseworkers. Okay, so these are the main results. We re-estimate this, then we do a lot of robustness checks. We look at other estimators that basically give similar results. We look at small and large job centers and things like this, and the results are basically robust to these different checks. But then we want to dig into like the heterogeneity potentially of the effect, right? So how do these overall effects come about? And one of the big questions we had was, how is this going to affect groups differently? And so here what you see is the effects broken down by gender and age. We have the contact rate again on the left and the exit to job rate again on the right. And this is the results for the Ukrainian refugees. And so what we notice here is that for Ukrainian refugees, the increases in the contact rate, the effects on the contact rate, are pretty homogeneous across the different genders and the different age groups, right? We have the females on the left, we have males on the right, and then the age is increasing from the top towards the bottom. And we can see that they're pretty uniform increases in terms of the contact rates for clients of the different genders and different age groups. And then what we see is that in terms of the exit to job rate, there's actually also a fairly uniform response. So we see increases in the exit to job rate essentially across both of the genders and across all of the age groups. The effects are maybe a little bit smaller for the oldest clients, but we see meaningful effects throughout. And so this, I think, is a pretty interesting result from the perspective of the literature, because previously what we found is that a lot of these programs might not work very well for female refugees in particular, where the labor market integration can end up being even more challenging. But here we see a pretty uniform response across the different groups. This picture is different for other refugees. So for other refugees, we see while contacts are increasing for all groups, although at a smaller level than for Ukrainians, we see that the effects in terms of increased placements are really very concentrated on young males. Okay, so you see the curves here on the right, that's where you see the effects. So for young males, we see positive and significant increases. That's where most of this average effect is coming from. But for females, we see only small effects for the youngest groups, but we basically see no effects for any of the older age groups, and we also don't see effects for old males. So here the effects are very heterogeneous and very concentrated on this one group, indicating that for female other refugees, the program was much less successful. Okay, so gender heterogeneity and age heterogeneity for the other refugee group, but uniform effects for the Ukrainian refugees. Then we looked at by region, and so what you can see here is that the effect is remarkably uniform across the different regions, which obviously have different labor markets and things like this. But we see here that this is broken down into the 10 different administrative districts. We see the contact rate effect pretty uniform across the different regions. There's some deviations, but they're fairly small. And then we see a pretty uniform effect in terms of the exit to job rate as well across these different regions, with some variation, but largely fairly uniform effects, indicating that this program really across the scale, essentially across the country, had these effects after activating this public employment service infrastructure in this way throughout the program. Okay, so the next question we're interested in is, what is the effect? How does that break down in terms of job skill levels? And so one of the concerns of the program might be, well, maybe caseworkers are placing refugees into just primarily low-skilled jobs that are not commensurate with their skills. And so these are like lower quality placements maybe to what we would have seen in the absence of the treatment. What we find here, when we break this down by the job skill level, the skill level in which people are being placed into, is that we actually have placements increasing across all the skill levels. So we broke this down here into low skill jobs, skill jobs, and high skill jobs using one of the standard classifications of job skill levels for Germany. And we find a pretty uniform response here for Ukrainian refugees. And in particular, still sizable effects for skill jobs, and even for high skill jobs, there's an increase that we see here. For other refugees, you can see that there's a lot more heterogeneity, and the increase in placements is concentrated in particularly in terms of increased placements in low skill jobs. There's a little bit for skill jobs, nothing for essentially high skill jobs. So again, you see a strong heterogeneity here for the other refugee group, while there's a pretty uniform response for the Ukrainian refugees. And so, but for Ukrainian refugees, we see a lot of placements into quote unquote more skilled jobs. Okay, so then the question we're interested in is, are these just short-term placements? Again, getting at the match quality. One potential possibility is that the placement rates go up, but a lot of the placements are not very good, and so they kind of fall apart pretty quickly. So what we do here is to try to look at this is we look at the exit to job rate by job retention. So at the top here, you see the exit to job rate for jobs where people are at least 3 months employed. In the middle row, at least 6 months employed, and at the bottom row, employed for 12 months. And what we see here is that basically for Ukrainian refugees, again, across the board, these placements, this increase in the placement seems to be very durable. So we see a very strong increase even for placements that last for at least 12 months. And if you look at the share of placements that have a high retention rate, that actually also slightly increased for Ukrainian refugees, indicating that the match quality, if anything, increased and didn't decrease, as would have been a concern. For Ukrainian refugees, we can see that the placements are also pretty durable, but the share of durable placements, if you use that as the outcome, did not increase, but it also didn't decrease. So we interpret this as basically no evidence that the match quality essentially decreased, but that if anything, it remained the same, and that these really led to increases that were in terms of sustainable placements. Okay, and then lastly, we break down the results by the unemployment duration. So here we just basically condition on, does this work more for people who've been short-term unemployed, or also longer periods unemployed? And what we see here is that basically across the board, for those that are just short-term employed, longer-term employed, we see increases in the exit to job rate for Ukrainian refugees. And similarly, for other refugees, we see a pretty similar response in terms of these increases across unemployment durations as well. Lastly, we look at one potential concern, which is that maybe one of the ways how this program also could have had an effect is by pushing people out of the labor market, out of the labor force. And so we look at that in the top row here, where we look at the exit to non-job outcomes, in particular, this exit of exiting the labor force completely. And what we see is that there's basically no effect for Ukrainian refugees and no effect for other refugees. We also look into other non-job outcomes, so apprenticeships, we don't see much. We see a slight increase in terms of training. These are mostly integration courses. And then these are other statuses, which is a very small group. And so we don't find much there, slight decrease for Ukrainians, potentially. Okay, so then we're interested in spillovers. So one of the potential concerns might be that, maybe there's going to be negative spillovers for non-refugee job seekers. So this could happen through at least 2 channels. They could be resource reallocation. So imagine contact rates go up for refugees. That means contact rates go down for other immigrants or German nationals. And then there could also be competition-induced displacement. So, if refugees are placed at a higher rate, maybe that creates more competition for vacancies if the local labor demand is pretty inelastic, and therefore it could put non-refugee job seekers sort of at a disadvantage. So the way we try to get at this is we basically look at geographic variation under the assumption that these spillovers should basically be strongest in job centers that have the highest pretreatment refugee client share. So where refugees make up the largest share of the client base of the local job center, that's where you would see the biggest operational shock. And then these effects might additionally be amplified, right? In particular in job centers where not only is there a high share of refugee clients, but also the general caseload prior to the program is particularly heavy, which can be measured by the client to caseworker ratio. So if that is very high, right, caseworkers are already maybe at the limit, and then you might see resource allocation effects be particularly strong. In terms of the displacement, we might see that mostly happening in slacker labor markets where you have a low vacancy to unemployment ratio. And so what we would expect is that if we compare these centers that have a high client share and a low client share, or also additionally conditioning on the caseloads and the slackness of the labor market, that's where we would expect the results, the outcomes for the non-refugee job seekers, the Germans, and the other immigrants to deteriorate more strongly than in the centers where you have low client share of refugees. So this is what you basically see here is that there's not much evidence of that happening. So this is the refugee client share on the x-axis. The outcome here is the change in the contact rate. So this is looking at the resource allocation effects. We have the Germans on the left, the other immigrants on the right. And in particular, the strongest effects that we would expect are right down here, where basically you have a lot of clients compared to a small number of staff in the pre-job turbo period. And then we would expect the deterioration to happen, particularly in these areas where prior to the intervention, the job center, the refugee client share is very high. But what we see is that, in high refugee centers versus low refugee centers, even, when the caseload is high, we basically see very similar outcomes for Germans in terms of the contact rate pre and post program. We see the same for other immigrants. So the line is not sloping down significantly, so indicating that there's no evidence of resource allocation effects. When you look at the displacement rates, we basically get the same results. So here we're looking at the exit to job rate. Again, we don't see any indication that the exit to job rate for Germans went more down in places where there was a higher refugee share, in particular, even in slacker labor markets. Same result for other immigrants. And then these are some regression tests. I'm just going to skip this here quickly in the interest of time. So when we control for other local labor market factors, we basically, again, see no effect of a higher refugee client share before and after, as you would expect under the spillover hypothesis. Okay, lastly, in terms of the mechanisms, so what drives these effects? Obviously, it's a bundled policy that had a couple of different components to it. We try in the paper to disentangle some of these components. In particular, right, like we try to get at, is it more driven by wage subsidies? So one potential is just that they just use subsidies a lot more. Is it driven by increased sanctions? Is it driven by increased counseling quality? Or is it really the increased counseling intensity that is doing most of the work? So I'm just quickly going to summarize these results here. Basically, in terms of wage subsidies, we do find that the majority of placements are into unsubsidized jobs. But we do find that the share of placements that go into jobs with wage subsidies slightly increases as a result of the program for Ukrainian refugees. This is the result that you see here at the bottom. It's about a 10 percentage point increase in the share of placements with wage subsidies. So they did use wage subsidies a bit more, but the overwhelming majority of placements are in these unsubsidized jobs, indicating that wage subsidies, if anything, played only a minor role in explaining the increased placement success. For other refugees, we see the share not even increasing. For sanctions, we don't find much. So the sanction rates in general are very, very low, in particular for the refugee groups. And there's not much of a differential change between the groups pre and post program. So we think sanctions are not really a big part of the story here. We basically think that most of the effects are indeed driven by the intensified counseling. So, right, what happened essentially is that when we look at the job center staff size, this is what you see at the top here, there was no change in the job center staff size pre and post program. Okay, so quite remarkable here basically that all of these additional contacts that happened as a result of the program were implemented by the same staff that was there before. So it was basically absorbed by the existing workforce in those job centers. So we estimate that on an individual caseworker level, the workload increased by about 7% as a result of the program. If you look at the monthly contacts per staff, basically that's what really increased dramatically. So people were working overtime, they were having more meetings as a result of the program. When we then look at a measure of the quality of the context, so one way that's hard to proxy, but one way to look at that is some of these job centers had created refugee-specific placement teams, which could be an indicator of the quality of the contexts that are happening. We see that the results are pretty uniform across job centers that had these refugee-specific teams or did not have them. So we don't think necessarily that the quality of the context changed very much. It was really the frequency of the context that changed. And then we try in the paper a little bit to get at like, okay, what was the return to the increase in the counseling specifically? That's obviously difficult because there might be other components of how the program affects outcomes. But if you are willing to make this exclusion restriction and say, okay, the program primarily worked through this increased contact, then you can estimate these IV models where we basically instrument the increase in the contact rate with the program, and we look at what is the return in terms of increased placements to a 1 percentage point increase in terms of the contact rate induced by the program. And what we find here is that in terms of the responsiveness to the increased contact rate, the responsiveness was actually higher for the other refugees than it was for the Ukrainians. Okay, so contact went. So the reason why the effects were bigger for Ukrainians overall was that contacts also went up more for Ukrainians. But conditional on these contacts going up, the response to the contacts was actually stronger for other refugees. But for other refugees, right, we see that the responsiveness is very much concentrated for males, for young males in particular that are being placed into these low-skilled jobs. That's where you see the biggest effects in terms of responding to the contacts. While for females, we basically see almost very limited responsiveness to the increased contacts. Now, it's important to emphasize that these, if you think of these as like returns to the increased contact rate, these are, if anything, I think like, potentially the upper bounds of what we could get. Because if the program also had other channels through which it positively affected the exited job rate, right, they would be kind of baked in here as well. So if anything, I think this gives us the upper bound of what we might expect for an increase, for an effect of the contacts specifically. Okay, so lastly, to wrap up here, the cost-benefit analysis, the basic takeaway here is that we estimate that for about if you look over a 12-month time horizon, the program essentially pays for itself. So you have some increased costs in terms of the moderate increased use of the wage subsidies and additional people entering into the integration training. But this is basically offset by the increased tax revenue, the welfare savings, and the healthcare insurance savings as well. So benefits obviously accruing after 12 months if people stay in those jobs. But if you just do it over 12 months, this is what you get. The program essentially pays for itself. And part of this is also that there was no cost for increased caseworker workforce because the number of caseworkers remained essentially the same. Okay, so what do we conclude? Well, we find these in the context of this particular program in Germany, which was rolled out nationwide. We find pretty strong and lasting job gains in terms of job placements, especially for Ukrainians. For other refugees, we find smaller but still meaningful benefits. And the heterogeneity here is that most of the success is coming from these increased placements for men that are placed into these low-skilled jobs. So in terms of the generalizability, what I think this suggests is that for the literature that the job counseling can be very effective for refugees, even if it's rolled out at scale and even in a situation where the general labor markets are fairly soft in terms of the macroeconomic climate in Germany at the time. Obviously, whether you could take these results and transfer them to other countries depends on several scope conditions, right? It's probably most applicable for refugees if they can gain access to the labor market pretty fast, and you have this public employment service that you can really mobilize very quickly. And obviously, there's a question of how sustainable this is going to be if the staffing didn't really increase, or if it's not going to increase at some point, people are going to be overworked, and you're not going to be able to get these sustain these increases in terms of contacts without potentially additional operational investments. Large and behold, I think there's, this somewhat challenges this qualification first paradigm. Like it does suggest that a more maybe hybrid approach of moving more towards a middle ground between qualifications first and work first can be effective and can yield some gains in terms of getting people into the labor market more quickly. We know that working can in and of itself have positive integration effects from other research. And so we don't look at that here, but that would be more of a long-term follow-up. And then I think also the weaker response for women in the other refugee group really suggests that, for this particular group, there's a need for complementary support and in order to overcome these more structural barriers, like the triple disadvantage that people have written about, where the counseling alone is basically not going to be that effective. So in terms of next steps, we obviously want to go to the microdata. That's something we're working on right now, which would give us more ability to look at these heterogeneous effects and pinpoint more precisely for whom the counseling can work. And we can also are really interested in looking at the interaction between the caseworker and the clients to see whether the match quality can have an effect in terms of higher or lower placements. So with that, I think I'm at time. And yeah, thank you for listening. And I'm looking forward to your comments and your feedback. Thank you.
Perfect timing, Jens. Thank you so much. Let's jump right into questions. First one by Claire Adida. Question is that the gender effect for non-Ukrainians is very interesting, but it looks like for non-Ukrainian men, you see an effect on the exit to job, but not so much for the contact rate. This also popped up later in your presentation with the very large two-stage least square effect, obviously. So Claire is asking sort of what you think is going on here, what explains this pattern?
In terms of the higher responsiveness for the male other refugees. Yeah, so I think what happens in terms of the if you look at where people are placed, you see that for the other refugee group, the placements for these younger males are basically happening into low-skilled jobs, and I think a big part of that is sort of like how gender segregated the low-skilled labor market is in Germany. Like if you look at the male jobs that people are being placed into, on the low-skilled end, a lot of them don't really require German skills. So these are mostly like transportation, low-skilled manufacturing, working in the lager and these other kind of like industries that require a lot of heavy manual labor, construction. Where younger males can more quickly be placed into. They don't really need recognition of their foreign credentials. They don't necessarily need German language skills in order to be placed into those jobs. While for women, right, you can see that on the low skilled end, a lot of the placements that would happen maybe are in healthcare or in education, childcare. Services where, like in Germany, it's more difficult to enter these jobs because typically they would require German skills, and they also would require some recognition of your foreign credentials. So I think that makes it a lot more difficult to get increased placements there, and it explains part of the heterogeneity of what's going on. I think we will also be able to look at this in more detail when we get the individual level data. That we don't have right now, but that's our initial interpretation of this heterogeneity that we see.
Fantastic.
Thanks for the question.
Stick to the heterogeneity. Yeah, we can. If you don't need the slides anymore, we can stop the screen sharing if that's okay. There were many questions on this heterogeneity, as you can imagine, Ian. So I'll just pick sort of follow-up question on this by Sandra Morgenstern, hailing from Germany. So we have to be careful with all the details. But her question is basically that one of the big differences between Ukrainian and other refugees is that with Ukrainian refugees, they are much more frequently women and much more frequently sort of like the new head of household because the man, because of military service, cannot leave the country, right? And that might be one of the big differences in terms of like household demographics and composition to the other nationality and other refugee groups that you're analyzing. So maybe you can comment a little bit on this, and also if you expect the micro level data that we will hopefully receive soon to allow you to share more light on this.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think this is a very good point, and I think this is what's often sort of subsumed in the triple disadvantage. I think there's definitely part of that is going on, right? Like you have childcare responsibilities, you're the head of the household. I think the increased job counseling, even if they tell you how to find a job, or where to apply, like it might not be possible for you to actually go through with the employment. And so I think this is definitely part of the story here. Unfortunately, with the aggregate level data, we don't have any information on the family situation or even the kids of the refugees here. So we can't really look at that kind of heterogeneity with this data. But I think it's something that we will be able to get at with the individual level data, hopefully. But I think my initial interpretation of this would definitely be that for this kind of situation, you would need some complementary support to overcome some of these additional barriers, and that the job search counseling in and of itself is it's insufficient, I think, to make a big difference here.
Fantastic. Alejandra also had a question about heterogeneity, and maybe by answering the question, you can first remind us what the sort of other refugee nationality, what that comprises in terms of nationalities, and how you think, because that's obviously not sort of a monolithic block at all. It's just like the administrative category that we are using. What are the big differences there, and how does that shape effects?
Yeah, so the countries that are in these 8 major origin groups, this is a very I mean, I first encountered this in the German bureaucracy. This is they call them the 8 HKL, the big 8. And this is Afghanistan, Eritrea, Iran, Iraq, Nigeria, Pakistan, Somalia, and Syria. And we have not the aggregate level data that we're using is not broken down by the specific countries of origin within that block of 8. So we actually weren't able to look at the heterogeneity within the different 8 major origin groups, but this is something that we definitely want to do when we get to the individual level data. I think that alone, breaking it down by these different groups, would tell us a lot more, because there are obviously differences between the refugees from those 8 major origin groups, but it's not something that we could have done yet with the aggregate level data. The advantage of the aggregate level data is that we're able to do it a bit more quickly. The individual level data usually takes quite some time before it's released. And so that's one of the advantages of it. And we try to do our best in terms of drilling into the different heterogeneities that we can see with the aggregate level data, but there's limits to that approach, obviously. Yeah, so we'll have to wait, and hopefully I'll have a better answer for you in the not too distant future from now.
Well, we'll ask you to come back, Jens. Matteo has a tricky but fair question about informal labor market, right? And so maybe you could explain a little bit, Jens. What we measure in terms of formal or informal placement, and if it's just sort of the formal labor market, how do you think might this bias our estimates?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we don't measure anything in terms of like informal labor markets. So the job we do have a wide variety of jobs within the formal labor market. So we look at full-time employment, part-time employment. We look at marginal employment. We look at mini jobs. But what we can't measure with this data is informal work that is happening. And so I think, like, my sense from the estimates that I've seen is that it's reasonably limited in Germany in terms of the informal work, but it's obviously not like this. I think there's some uncertainty about that because it's difficult to measure. To the extent that it would bias our estimates, I think we already see pretty large increases in terms of the formal employment here. So I'm not sure that it would challenge those results. Essentially, like maybe there's additional, increases that are coming from formal employment, or some people like switching from formal to informal employment, which I think would be part of the effect of the program then. I don't think that there's a compensating sort of, switch that you see for other immigrants or Germans, I think, moving from formal to informal employment. I would be very surprised if that's what we would see. But yeah, in the absence of data on informal employment, it's not something we can look at.
Great. We got a fascinating question about one of the biggest differences between Germany and the US when it comes to refugee integration, which is sort of this work first versus language first approach, right? And Fethi points out that this work first approach, which is, as they say, a hallmark of refugee resettlement in the US, will mean faster incorporation into the labor market. It also means potentially prioritizing employment over and above everything else, including sort of delayed language acquisition, which can have like long-term negative repercussions, right? And so obviously, your work is building on Germany, which was very much the opposite for a long time, and it's now gradually changing. So maybe you can speak a little bit to sort of these broader policy debates and how you think about that based on what you learned from this switch in Germany.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking about two different, ends of the spectrum here. I mean, I think in the US, right, the approach is very, very strongly focused on work first, in the sense that there was, very minimal support. Refugees arrive and they're essentially thrown into the deep end, like they have to find work in order to survive. And so what we see as a result of that is this very quick uptake of employment, often first in survival jobs, and then we see that because the labor market is also a lot more flexible, the entry tends to be easier. And then there's questions about how long, like, is there upward mobility sort of in the long term, or how does it affect other dimensions of integration if there's such a heavy emphasis on work rather than language or other dimensions of integration. And then in Europe, like in Germany in particular, right, the approach for a long time has been hold people back from the labor market, make sure they have all the qualifications, and then only slowly transition them in at the appropriate level when they have the language, when they have the recognition of the credentials, etc. And so I think I think the way I want to interpret this is that a move towards more of a middle ground can be quite beneficial. I do think whether, how this is going to affect long-term integration, it's still very much an empirical question. And so this would be great to follow up with this over more of the long term. My hunch would be that it's going to be pretty beneficial for integration, because we do have quite good evidence that language acquisition, for example, depending on the type of job that you work, there can be positive benefits from that, because you have more increased interactions outside of the household with others. And you learn a lot about the host country by working in these jobs. So I could see there being positive knock-on effects from that on other dimensions of integration. It doesn't necessarily have to be this sort of traditional linear process of like language first and then the other dimensions follow. I think these dimensions of integration, they can accelerate at different speeds, and there can be positive effects between the different dimensions as well. As part of a study, we're currently looking into this more long-term integration of refugees, comparing some European countries and the US and Canada as part of a National Academy of Sciences panel. Like they're writing a report where they're looking into this, and so the results, I think, there for the long-term integration are quite positive for the US approach, actually faster and at higher levels, even 10, 15 years down the line than what we see in some of the European countries that we have in that comparison data set. But that's still work in progress. But some preliminary evidence for this, potentially being beneficial.
Great. We can have one last question. I ask it quickly. I ask you to answer it quickly. Aura is interested in economic integration and other dimensions of integration, and whether that is conditioned by levels of nativism or cultural discrimination. And to be more specific, whether you think this might condition the benefits of the Job Turbo program and might explain some of the differences between Ukrainian and other refugees who might be even more marginalized and discriminated against.
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely a possibility. I think maybe the closest to what we have here is the regional variation. Like maybe you think that, I mean, there might be differences in nativism towards the different groups, but you would also think that it would maybe regionally vary. And we don't see strong differences in terms of the regional variation, in terms of the increases in the exit to job rate, which would maybe speak against that that idea, at least to the extent that it's captured in regional variation. Obviously, that regional variation is also confounded by other differences between those regions. But in terms of the overall differences between the two groups, that's probably something that also could contribute, and maybe something that also will come out a little bit more in the individual level work when we can look at these different groups in specifically, because maybe attitudes of natives towards these different groups might differ as well, and we maybe see that reflected in different placement rates. And also maybe more qualitative work with caseworkers that might have experience with that in terms of trying to place refugees into these jobs would be helpful for that as well. But yeah, thank you for the question.
Well, thank you, Jens, again for a fascinating presentation. Thank you all in the audience for joining and for your engagement and your questions. I do have to close now, but I'm already looking forward to the next seminar when on December 11, Leah Bouston from Yale and Princeton University will be presenting. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you, folks. Thank you. Bye.